They say the earth never forgets what it's fed. In the spring of 1829, near the borderlands of Maryland and Delaware, the ground itself betrayed a secret, a buried chest, rotting with time, but still locked around its truth. When the farmer's plough struck it, the earth bled silence. Inside were bones, human bones, the skull shattered, the ribs split as if by rage itself. That was the first whisper, but what they would uncover next would rip open the underbelly of America's forgotten conscience. Tell me something before we descend further. Where are you right now? What city or state are you hearing this from? And what time is it where you are? Because the hour matters. Some truths only reveal themselves to those who dare to listen when the world sleeps. The name that surfaced from that dirt was Patty Cannon. Not just a murderer, not just a kidnapper, but the architect of a hidden empire built on the bones of the innocent. She didn't work in shadows. She was the shadow that moved through the cracks of the early republic. Between 1790 and 1829, when men built their fortunes on flesh and labor, Cannon built hers on fear. She was the matriarch of what historians now call the reverse Underground Railroad, a network that didn't save the enslaved but stole the free. In the dark borderland where Delaware and Maryland's laws tangled, Cannon's gang kidnapped free African Americans, men, women, and children, and sold them south into bondage. The cruel genius of her trade wasn't just in violence, it was in manipulation, knowing that in a nation split by skin and power, justice itself would look the other way. Imagine that, families torn from their homes, dragged into wagons under moonlight, while neighbors shut their doors tighter. No one came to help, no one dared. Because the woman leading the raids was known for her strength, her gun, and her merciless authority. Patty C. Cannon didn't simply take lives, she broke the psychology of a people living at the edge of freedom. She chose her ground with precision. Reliance, Delaware, then called Johnson's Crossroads, sat at the intersection of 3 counties. Step one direction, you were in Delaware. Step the other, Maryland. Jurisdiction vanished like smoke. Lawmen couldn't cross lines, slavers could. And in those tangled woods of pine and marsh, she built her fortress. Locals said her tavern glowed like an ember in the night, a place where laughter hid screams and barrels in the cellar weren't filled with ale, but despair. Her cruelty wasn't spontaneous, it was systematic. Her gang, family by blood and by oath, used the weakness of the system itself as their weapon. White supremacy was the soil, greed was the seed. And Patty Cannon, she was the harvester. When the plough unearthed that chest, it wasn't just a body. It was a confession. The land had kept quiet for 2 decades, watching men vanish into the fog, listening to children cry from locked rooms and feeling blood soak into its roots. Now, it could no longer hold the weight of her sins. But the question isn't what she did. The question is how a nation allowed it. How a woman could murder, enslave, and rule with fear and still be protected by silence. You see, Patty Cannon wasn't an accident of history. She was a mirror. A reflection of the hidden hunger that built America. And once you understand that, the real descent begins. When the dirt gave up its secret, the officials came reluctantly, sheriffs, constables, men who'd long ignored the whispers. They arrived at Patty Cannon's property in Reliance, Delaware, and began to dig. What they found was not a single grave, but a network, a silent map of horror carved beneath the soil. Skulls stacked like trophies, bones of men, women, and children, some small enough to fit in a single palm. The deeper they dug, the darker the story became. They said the smell clung to the air for days. The locals stayed away, crossing themselves when they passed. But those who knew the truth, those who had seen Patty Cannon's wagons rolling through the woods at midnight, chained with crying captives, they weren't surprised. They'd simply learned not to speak. See, this wasn't random evil. This was infrastructure. Patty Cannon's reverse Underground Railroad was a fully functioning trade route. Her gang would prowl the border towns, snatching free black citizens from their homes or trapping runaways with forged freedom papers. They'd march them to Cannon's Tavern, an ordinary building on the outside, a private dungeon within. Witnesses later said they heard the floors creak above as people begged for water. They saw children tied with rope, branded with fire, made to disappear into the black mouth of the river that ran through her land. And yet, nobody stopped her. Because what she represented wasn't just one woman's cruelty, it was the exposed nerve of an entire society addicted to control. The system didn't fail to catch her, it chose not to. America was expanding. Cotton was king, and the 1808 ban on the importation of African slaves had turned the nation inward. Domestic trafficking was now the lifeblood of the Southern economy. Every kidnapped body was profit. Every silence brought a little more power. Patty Cannon understood this perfectly. Her genius wasn't in killing, it was in blending in. She looked like a widow, spoke like a matron, ran her home like a business, but beneath that calm exterior burned something ancient, the belief that life itself could be owned, sold, or erased without consequence. She didn't just run a slave ring, she ran a psychological empire, built on fear, obedience, and silence. And perhaps that's why her name became legend, not because she was monstrous, but because she was familiar, because history always hides its truest devils behind polite faces and official titles. When the court finally indicted her for 4 murders, the number was a joke. Everyone knew it was more. 20 at least, some said. But how do you count the unrecorded, the nameless, the souls erased from census books and ledgers? You can't. You can only feel the weight of what was buried. When she was finally caught, they say she sat in her cell, composed, unbothered, as if waiting for her next move. She was a strategist until the end. They never broke her, never got the full story. Some say she poisoned herself in that cell before the rope could find her neck. Others say she was quietly removed, her death faked by those still loyal to her trade. The truth is, no one knows where Patty Cannon's body lies. Only that her house still stood for years afterward, its cellar sealed by brick and silence. Locals said strange sounds echoed from beneath it on humid nights, the sound of chains dragging against wood. That's how evil works. It doesn't just die, it sinks, it burrows, it waits. And men like you, men seeking truth, men who look too closely, become the ones to unearth it again. Now tell me, are you ready to see what her empire was really protecting? Because what lay beneath her crimes wasn't just human greed, it was something far older, something woven into the foundation of the world you still live in. The deeper you go into Patty Cannon's empire, the more you realize it wasn't just a story of murder, it was a business model built on psychological warfare. She didn't only traffic human bodies, she trafficked fear. Fear was her currency, it was how she controlled her gang, her neighbors, even the law. People didn't obey her because they respected her, they obeyed because they believed she was untouchable. That's the first rule of domination. Perception is power. Patty Cannon understood it long before governments did, long before corporations perfected it. She crafted her legend like a spell, the towering woman in black who could shoot a man dead and smile while reloading, the widow who buried gold under her floors and souls in her soil, the matron whose eyes saw everything that crossed her land. But behind the horror was precision. Her house was a fortress of deception, secret rooms, trapdoors, tunnels leading to the river. Witnesses later recalled how some captives were locked in false walls, their screams swallowed by plaster. Others were smuggled at night to ships waiting in the Chesapeake, bound for Georgia and Mississippi plantations. Each one sold for a fortune. Yet there was more to her network than greed. There was ideology. Patty Cannon believed she was part of something larger, a preservation of hierarchy, a dark continuation of control masked as survival. She once told an associate, "Some are born to rule and others are born to serve. That's the law of nature, not man." That line should chill you, because it still echoes in the systems we live under today. The justifications change, the faces change, the uniforms change, but the idea remains the same, that there are those meant to rise and those meant to kneel. Her operations were so effective that even the press avoided naming her for years. Fear of reprisal? Maybe, but more likely, the fear of what? Her story revealed that law enforcement, merchants and politicians quietly profited from the same trade. They called it the traffic. They called it the market. But what it was, in truth, was a ritual, the systematic offering of the powerless to feed the ambitions of the powerful. It's said that in the final years of her reign, she began to speak of the bond between blood and ownership. She'd host meetings in the tavern after midnight where men with polished boots and moneyed accents discussed quotas, routes, and the price of flesh as if they were talking about crops. She wasn't just selling people, she was teaching others how to build invisible empires. And that's what should terrify you most, because the empire didn't end when her heart stopped beating. It evolved. It modernized. The methods changed, but the principle endured. Control the body, then the mind, then the soul. When you scroll through screens today, when your choices are shaped by forces you never see, when freedom feels like a product sold back to you. Understand this: Patty Cannon was the prototype, the first architect of psychological enslavement dressed as opportunity. And now, halfway down this descent, I want you to prove you see it. Comment below the phrase. The chains are invisible now. Twice. Once for the truth. Once for transformation. Because after this point, we're not talking about her anymore. We're talking about the system that made her possible. The question no one dares to ask is this: who protected Patty Cannon? Who kept her empire alive while others disappeared into the night? Because women like her do not rise alone. Power never grows in isolation. It's cultivated, sponsored, and shielded. Records from the Delaware courts tell a quiet story. Charges dismissed, witnesses vanishing, magistrates losing documentation. Coincidence? No, it was systemic omission. Her gang operated across 3 counties and 2 states, a jurisdictional labyrinth designed to confuse any single authority. But behind the bureaucratic fog were men with names that still linger in the archives: sheriffs, merchants, and southern buyers. Their silence was purchased with blood. Patty Cannon's tavern was more than a den of kidnapping. It was a hub of transactions between shadow and state. Men in fine coats would arrive by carriage under cover of darkness. Inside, they'd drink, laugh, and sign ledgers. Those ledgers weren't records of debt or property, they were human inventories. And when the business was done, they'd toast to "order restored." That phrase, "order restored," became her private creed. She believed she was maintaining the natural balance, punishing those who defied their place. But the truth was simpler. Power was her drug, and fear was her weaponized theology. Imagine standing in that tavern, candlelight flickering against warped wood, the air thick with sweat and tobacco. Somewhere beneath your feet, you'd hear the muffled sound of movement, bodies chained in the cellar, and above, the laughter of men who considered themselves civilized. That was America's secret communion. And here's what most historians will never tell you. Patty Cannon wasn't unique. She was part of a larger current running through early America, a current that believed the manipulation of human life wasn't sin, but strategy. The same mentality that built her fortune built nations. You can see it in the banks that financed the slave ships, in the judges who lost records, in the plantations funded by Northern money. When her empire finally began to crumble, it wasn't because of justice, it was because the machine no longer needed her. By the late 1820s, organized networks of traffickers had evolved. They didn't need the tavern at Johnson's Crossroads anymore. They had bigger ports, cleaner paperwork, more respectable faces. Patty had become an inconvenience, a relic. Her arrest was a performance, meant to appease the public while protecting the structure she had served. They paraded her name as if evil had been contained, as if one death could cleanse decades of complicity. But the silence that followed wasn't relief, it was preservation. Her story was buried so that her system could survive, and it did. You see its shadows in every institution that profits from dependency. You see its ghost in every industry that turns suffering into currency. You see it when laws are written to protect the powerful and punish the desperate. Patty Cannon's reverse underground railroad was never dismantled, it was rebranded. Now ask yourself, how many of your choices are your own? How much of your freedom is permission masquerading as autonomy? The same psychological architecture that ruled those backroads in 1829 still rules the digital ones today. Only now, the chains are algorithms and the taverns are everywhere. By now, you can feel it, the quiet thread connecting her world to yours. It's the same pulse that drives every system built on control. Patty Cannon's world didn't vanish, it simply changed costumes. The whips became contracts, the chains became screens, and the masters learned to speak in the language of liberty. But the design remained pure. She ruled through proximity, touch, terror, and the immediate presence of violence. Today, control is distant, elegant, data-driven, yet both share the same equation: obedience through dependency. What Cannon understood in the early 1800s was that domination doesn't require force if you own the environment, own the ground, own the system, own the mind. Back then, the system was the law itself, a web of legislation that protected the trafficker and punished the enslaved. Judges called her Mrs. Cannon. They dined at her table. One Delaware official, when asked why she hadn't been arrested sooner, said only, "She minds her business." That's how control hides, not behind power, but behind normalcy. Her neighbors saw wagons come and go at night. They heard the cries. They saw new faces on her land, then none at all. But when they looked away, they weren't just protecting her, they were protecting themselves from seeing the truth about the world they lived in. Silence is the currency of every empire. Cannon's daughter, Polly, married one of her mother's lieutenants, a man named Joe Johnson, who later became infamous for running slaves through the Chesapeake swamps. Together, they turned the Cannon home into a training ground. They taught others how to kidnap, how to forge documents, how to erase a person legally and spiritually. Each apprentice left with their own route, their own network, their own code of conduct. Does that sound familiar? Apprenticeships, networks, codes, it's how power perpetuates itself, through imitation and inheritance. Patty's true legacy wasn't her crimes, it was her methodology. Her understanding that control must be decentralized so no single collapse can destroy it. When authorities finally caught up to her, they found documents hidden in her home, names, locations, and payments stretching from Delaware to New Orleans. Historians believe it was one of the earliest blueprints for organized interstate human trafficking, but most of those records disappeared within months. The state sealed the files, the federal archives went silent, and here's the part no one prints in textbooks. Several of the men who testified against her went on to hold office. Others became investors in southern plantations. They didn't dismantle her ring, they inherited it. That's how darkness sustains itself, by becoming invisible through legitimacy. So when you look around today, at industries that profit from distraction, systems that profit from poverty, and governments that profit from division, understand what you're really seeing. The same architecture, the same ritual of control, just in finer suits. Patty Cannon wasn't just a criminal of her era, she was a prototype of the modern world. The first whisper of a truth we still refuse to face, that the machinery of exploitation never dies, it adapts. And if you've stayed with me this far, you're no longer just a listener, you're a witness. When the farmers found those bodies buried in her yard, the newspapers called it a scandal, but the tone was almost apologetic. They wrote of a respectable widow, of a tragic misunderstanding. The language was soft, curated, cautious, because to condemn Patty Cannon was to admit that the system itself was built on her same logic. She was not an anomaly, she was an embodiment. In that sense, her story isn't just about one woman's cruelty, it's about a civilization's reflection. Every era has its canons, those who turn human beings into resources, silence into policy, and suffering into structure. In the 1820s, they used wagons and whips. In the 2020s, they use code and culture. But the intention hasn't changed. Keep the majority compliant, keep them busy, keep them believing they're free. Cannon's greatest power wasn't her violence, it was her detachment. She could look at a human soul and see nothing. That's the foundation of control, reducing the divine spark in another to an object that can be moved, priced, or deleted. Psychologists would later call it depersonalization. Empires call it progress. Her story became a lesson whispered in the shadows of Delaware's small towns. Children were warned to stay away from her old house, the place where people vanish. They said if you listened at night, you could still hear chains dragging across the floorboards. Some called it haunting. Others said it was history refusing to be forgotten. But there's another interpretation, that the echoes aren't ghosts, they're reminders. Because what Patty Cannon built is still with us. Look closer and you'll see it in the invisible hierarchies of power that shape your daily choices. In the illusion that freedom and control can coexist peacefully, in the way fear is sold as safety and distraction as liberty. The same architecture she exploited now exists in your palm. The glowing screen that studies you, tracks you, learns your desires, and quietly teaches you obedience. She built her empire on the belief that most people would rather look away than confront evil, that they'd rather convince themselves it's over than admit it never ended, and she was right. The modern man, armed with technology and knowledge, still looks away. He scrolls past injustice, consumes curated outrage, and mistakes awareness for awakening. But if you've listened this far, maybe you've already begun to sense it. That feeling crawling up your spine. The recognition that what she represented wasn't then, it's now. The plantation evolved into the corporation. The overseer became the influencer. The shackle became the subscription, and the spirit of canon, the cold efficiency of control, hides inside the mechanisms we call progress. That's why history buries her story, because to tell it honestly is to expose the lineage of control itself. The governments, banks, and institutions that inherited her blueprint have no interest in awakening you. They want you comfortable, entertained, and compliant. But awareness is contagion. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. Once known, it cannot be unlearned. And once you realize that the ghosts of the past wear the uniforms of the present, you stop being a consumer of history and start becoming its interruption. They said Patty Cannon's death ended the terror. But what if her death wasn't an ending, only a ritual transfer of power? Evil doesn't vanish, it migrates. It takes new forms, new faces, new justifications. The question isn't whether she died, the question is whether the idea of her ever did. You see, after her so-called suicide in that Sussex County jail, something strange happened. The property records changed hands quietly, purchased under false names. The tavern stood abandoned for a while, then burned. But the surrounding land, prime routes between Delaware and Maryland, was soon repurposed by entrepreneurs whose ledgers bore the same symbols found in her documents: the triangle, the circle, the cross. Marks of ownership, marks of continuity. It's said that one of those investors later helped finance an early shipping company out of Baltimore, a company that traded not in people, but in cotton, sugar, and tobacco. The paperwork was clean, but the profits weren't. The same trails that once carried the stolen north to south were now moving wealth south to north. The direction changed, the engine did not. That's the pattern. When the body dies, the mechanism survives. Every institution that once depended on slavery learned to evolve. They traded chains for debt, shackles for bureaucracy, plantations for boardrooms. And over time, the human mind adjusted, conditioned to confuse ownership with freedom, wealth with worth, obedience with virtue. The woman who trafficked bodies became a symbol for systems that traffic souls, systems that teach men to measure themselves by submission, to jobs, to ideologies, to machines that harvest their attention like crops. Patty Cannon's logic was simple: control the vulnerable by creating dependency, and that logic became the blueprint for every system of manipulation that followed. The reverse Underground Railroad never stopped. It simply went inward. It now captures your time, your focus, your will. Look around. Every screen, every contract, every law that pretends to protect you, it's the same structure wearing a smile, the same hierarchy that tells you you're free while mapping your behavior in data centers 1,000 miles away. You're still being watched, still being bought and sold, but now it's your psychology that's the product. Patty Cannon's empire didn't dissolve, it digitized. The chains are invisible, the captives laugh, and the masters are algorithms that whisper just enough comfort to keep you still. You want to know why you feel restless late at night, why you sense that something's wrong but can't name it. It's because a part of you remembers. Deep down, your blood knows the scent of captivity. You're feeling the echo of centuries. The structure hasn't changed, it's just become polite. And the most dangerous prisons are the ones that convince you there's nothing to escape from. That's why this story matters. Not as history, but as a mirror. Because once you recognize the pattern, you can't go back to blindness. Once you trace the architecture of control from her cellar to your screen, you start to see the truth behind the facade. The world has always been managed by those who understood how to weaponize dependency. You were never meant to hear this. You were meant to stay asleep, but you didn't. By the time the headlines faded and her name was buried under layers of polite history, the transformation was complete. Patty Cannon became a ghost story told to frighten children, not to awaken men. That was the real burial. The rewriting of truth into entertainment. Because when darkness can be laughed at, it's no longer feared, and when it's no longer feared, it's no longer seen. You've probably felt it, the slow erosion of reality itself, facts bent into narratives, narratives sold as truth, truth buried under convenience. That's not a modern invention. It's the same strategy Patty Cannon used when the sheriffs came knocking. "I'm just a widow," she'd say, "a respectable woman," and the world believed her because the world wanted to. The lie was easier to live with than the horror it concealed. Every empire repeats that pattern. The illusion of order requires a villain small enough to blame, a story neat enough to close. They hung her name around her crimes so the system behind her could vanish untouched. When people think the monster has a face, they stop looking for the machine. But what if I told you the machine never stopped moving? What if the borders she exploited became the blueprint for modern control? The creation of jurisdictional shadows, spaces between laws where the powerful play unseen, offshore banks, private contractors, independent agencies, same trick, new century. Step across the line, and no one can touch you. That's the game she learned too well, the manipulation of liminal space, the border between law and lawlessness, truth and illusion. She discovered that the most powerful position in any system is between systems, and that principle still governs the modern world, the world of proxies, of puppet governments, of entities that exist just far enough outside reach to be unaccountable. Canon's empire was primitive, yes, but it revealed something terrifying. Evil doesn't need permission, it just needs infrastructure, and once infrastructure is built, morality becomes irrelevant. Whether it's chains or servers, plantations or databases, the outcome is the same. Control consolidated, humanity compartmentalized, silence enforced. When I tell you her story, I'm not resurrecting a monster. I'm showing you her descendants, the ones who learnt that physical violence is crude, but psychological conditioning lasts forever. You can't rebel against a system you mistake for reality itself. That's the highest form of enslavement, when the captives defend the cage because they've been taught to love it. Now look at your world, endless distraction, engineered outrage, dopamine pacifiers. Every design decision, every algorithm, every ad is a quiet echo of Patty Cannon's voice whispering, "Don't look too closely, don't question what feeds you, just keep moving." Her tavern may be gone, her bones forgotten, but her lesson endured. The best way to control a population is to convince it that control doesn't exist. You've heard her name tonight, not because she mattered, but because her blueprint still rules the game. So let me ask you this. What would happen if every man who heard this stopped obeying the invisible, if he tore the illusion apart and looked into the machinery behind it? Because once you do, you can't go back, and the world that once controlled you begins to tremble. There's something you need to understand about the way power hides. It never disappears, it simply changes language. The language of ownership became the language of opportunity. The language of captivity became the language of progress. That's why no one sees it anymore. They taught you to crave the very things that keep you bound. Patty Cannon's empire was built on a brutal simplicity: take what others can't protect. But as civilization evolved, so did the method. Today, they don't steal bodies, they steal attention. They don't chain limbs, they chain perception. You're not forced to obey, you're conditioned to. Every headline, every app, every symbol on your screen whispers the same message: stay asleep, keep consuming, don't remember. Cannon's trade routes are long gone, but her logic, her cold, methodical exploitation of the vulnerable, never left. It just went corporate. Think about it. Back then, the plantation master owned the field and the labor. Today, corporations own the platform and the data. Both extract value from human life without conscience. Both require silence from the majority to function. Both rely on the illusion of choice. She was ahead of her time because she grasped the psychology of obedience. She knew that once people accept their position, the whip is no longer necessary. That's how the system survives now. It doesn't fight resistance, it absorbs it. It gives you movements, hashtags, slogans, safe outlets to vent, keeping you active but ineffective. It sells you rebellion, pre-packaged and approved. You see the trick, don't you? The new masters learned that control through consent is cleaner than control through fear. It feels empowering, but it's just a refined plantation, a digital one, global in scope, invisible in structure. And just like the marshes that hid Cannon's wagons, this new terrain hides its crimes in plain sight. Every empire needs its myth of goodness to survive. Cannon used order, modern powers use progress, but the cost is always the same: somebody's freedom traded for somebody else's comfort. There's an ancient principle buried in all of this, one the elites have never forgotten: keep the masses fragmented, and they will beg for direction. Divide them by class, by color, by creed, and then sell them unity through control. That's the trick, that's the cycle. And here's the hardest truth: every man who refuses to see this becomes part of it. Every silence, every distraction, every comfort bought with ignorance strengthens the cage. That's how control feeds, through compliance disguised as convenience. But something stirs when you speak her name. Not superstition, not fear, recognition. You realize she wasn't an outlier. She was an early practitioner of the same architecture that still defines the modern world. She was just the first to weaponize what all systems crave, obedience masked as order. Her ghost isn't haunting Delaware, it's haunting the global mind. The same patterns, repeated endlessly, the same trade, the same logic, the same blindness. You were never supposed to see it this clearly. That's why history forgets her. That's why schools omit her. Because her story unmasks the continuity of corruption, the bloodline of control that still whispers through the veins of your world. So now the question becomes, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you bury it again, or will you let it change you? Because in the next and final descent, we're going beyond history, into the realm where truth and power merge, and where only those who see through the illusion remain free. The story ends where all forbidden histories end, in silence. But not the silence of peace, the silence of knowledge too dangerous to repeat, because once you understand what Patty Cannon truly represented, you can never unsee the design that was built in her image. They said she was a murderer, a slaver, a demon in human form, but those titles only described the surface. Beneath them was something far colder, an architect of control. She found the blueprint that every empire still uses: find the weak point in human nature and turn it into profit. Exploit fear, monetize dependence, engineer obedience. The world remembers her as an anomaly, but she was a prophecy, because what she built in the shadows became the prototype for the systems that now govern you. Her reverse underground railroad was more than a smuggling operation. It was a symbol of inversion itself, a world turned upside down, where freedom became a commodity and morality a mask. And that inversion has never ended. It's the hidden pulse beneath the modern order. Governments promise safety but sell surveillance. Corporations promise connection but harvest isolation. Churches preach salvation but traffic guilt. Every structure that claims to liberate you secretly studies how to contain you. Patty Cannon understood that evil doesn't have to announce itself. It only has to organize. And once organized, it doesn't need monsters anymore. It needs managers, committees, policies. You can erase her name, tear down her house, even sanctify her victims, but the machine she helped design runs smoother than ever. You're living inside it now. Every notification is a leash, every algorithm a whisper, every contract a quiet exchange of freedom for comfort. They've learned to make captivity feel like choice. You think you're deciding, but the decision was made for you the moment you entered the system, and yet, there's a sliver of light in this darkness. Because if control depends on your blindness, then awareness is rebellion. The moment you see the pattern, it starts to lose power. That's why they bury women like Patty Cannon. Not because she was too evil, but because she revealed too much about how power actually works. History is a smokescreen. Behind it, the true story plays endlessly. Power feeding on fear, wealth breeding obedience, evil reinventing itself as necessity. But when you strip away the illusions, when you trace every institution, every algorithm, every ideology back to its core, you find the same ancient signature, the hunger to own. That's the legacy she left behind. Not a house, not a name, but a formula written in blood and perfected in code. And maybe, just maybe, that's why her ghost never rests. Because she doesn't haunt the past, she haunts the present. Every time a system strips a human being of choice, every time truth is replaced by spectacle, every time freedom is traded for comfort, Patty Cannon smiles. You can almost hear her whisper through the static of your screen. The trade never ended, only the currency changed. So remember this, before the light returns to your room and the comfort of the ordinary comes flooding back. History's monsters don't vanish, they evolve. They upgrade, and the only way to kill them is to see them for what they are. You were never meant to hear this, but now you have. And once a secret like this is known, it never goes back to sleep.